Your father is no longer with us, you know. This house belongs to me, his wife. So you better leave soon, my stepmother said in a tone like she was scolding a small child. The funeral for my father had just ended, my heart as dark and heavy as an overcast sky was disturbed, and in my anger I retorted, yours. This is my childhood home. You're the one who should leave. After all your affairs with younger men, betraying my father over and over, you have no right to call yourself his wife. As I glared at her, she placed her hands on her hips and snorted dismissively. Well, that's too bad. Unfortunately for you, I'm inheriting this house and the $1 million estate. I am kind enough to share a little, though. How about $50? With that, my stepmother laughed loudly, and I couldn't help but laugh along. This seemed to annoy her, who furrowed her brow and visibly became upset. What's so funny? No, it's just you really know nothing, do you? Your head is a bit too much in the clouds, isn't it? I then presented a document to her, who was turning red with anger. Can you read this? At that moment, my stepmother's face turned pale. No, it can't be. It's a lie, right? My name is Kelly. I am a 29-year-old homemaker, also working part-time. My father was a lawyer, fairly well known among his peers. He started his own law firm and worked tirelessly with a few colleagues. My mother passed away when I was young, and I barely remember her. My father was always busy with work, so I was raised mostly by my grandmother. However, I never felt dissatisfied with this life. Even without my parents, my grandmother was always kind, and I was fortunate in my other relationships as well, supported by many. I grew up smoothly and graduated from high school without trouble. But as I began to enjoy my university life, a shadow fell over my seemingly perfect existence. A new mother appeared in our family, which had always been just my father and me. This lady will be your mother from today. Try to get along. The woman suddenly introduced to me was clad in designer brands from head to toe. Nice to meet you, Kelly. You can call me Mom, and we can go shopping together. While she seemed like a bright and beautiful person, someone I might have gotten along with as a neighbor, living with her as a mother was a different story. In conclusion, our personalities did not mesh well. I'm more of an indoor person, preferring to relax at home with a coffee on days off. On the other hand, my stepmother couldn't sit still, always going out shopping or to drinking parties. I didn't exactly dislike her, but we tended to avoid each other. But that wasn't the real problem. What came later was much more significant. After graduating from university, I was hired as an office worker at a general company. My workplace was about a 20-minute train ride from home, so I planned to commute from my parents' house for the time being. My relationship with my stepmother continued as usual, without any attacks or harassment, so I decided not to move out immediately. Anyway, about 6 months after joining the company, I attended a social gathering organized by my colleagues. I'm not good with alcohol, so I wasn't enthusiastic. But I couldn't miss the drinking party as almost all my coworkers were going. On the way home from the party, walking with a few people who were heading in the same direction through a bustling street crowd, I spotted a familiar figure from behind. It was my stepmother. While thinking that this was where she was hanging out, I inadvertently looked next to her and noticed an unfamiliar young man walking alongside her. If they were merely walking next to each other, I could have believed they were just friends despite the age difference. However, shockingly, she had her arm entwined with the young man's arm. The unmistakably intimate atmosphere made me involuntarily catch my breath. A colleague walking next to me asked, "What's wrong?" All I could do was laugh it off, unable to tell a colleague who I had only known for a few months that my stepmother might be cheating with a young man. So I made up an excuse about having somewhere to be and sent my colleagues home first, deciding to follow my stepmother. Fortunately, it was easy to follow them in the bustling crowd of the lively downtown area. My stepmother and the young man occasionally leaned in close to talk to each other, looking every bit like a cozy couple. After about 3 minutes of walking, my stepmother and the young man looked around cautiously before entering a building. It turned out to be a lodging facility. The shock was so great that I felt nauseous, but quickly left the area. I had sensed that my stepmother was a flashy, sociable type, but I never imagined she would cheat. This was a betrayal against my father and against me as well. Angered by her immoral behavior, I decided to confront her the next day when she returned home in the morning. As if nothing had happened, she said sarcastically, slightly drunk from a night of drinking, "I saw you were arm in arm with a young man entering a short-stay hotel." Try making an excuse for that, caught off guard by my directness. My stepmother froze with her mouth open, but quickly managed a smile. Are you sure that was really me? You didn't see me from the front, right? Maybe it was someone who looks like me." She was implicitly challenging me to produce proof. That put me in a difficult position because I didn't have any evidence, even though I saw it with my own eyes. She could easily dodge the issue like this. "You're too naive, Kelly dear. Maybe it's because you're from a good family. You want to drive me out of the house, but that's too bad. Come back when you can prove it." With that, she lifted her chin triumphantly and looked down at me. Frustrated, I decided to prove her infidelity. I spent all the money I could on a private investigator who, after a week, confirmed my suspicions. Astonishingly, it turned out that she was cheating with 3 different men at the same time, all of them young. Now, armed with this information, I went to my father. He had always been busy since my childhood. "Dad, it's about Mom," I said. My father glanced at me briefly before returning his gaze to the documents in front of him. "I'm busy now. Talk later. And it's Mom, not the woman. I don't care about that she's cheating." I was cut off as my father's smartphone rang. He answered it without excusing himself. It was always like this, neglected by a father too busy with his work. It might sound immature for someone over 20, but it wasn't fair. What was I getting so heated about? What was I even expecting? It all seemed so foolish. Disillusioned, I decided to move out on my own, distancing myself physically from my father and stepmother. Living on my own for the first time was chaotic and challenging, but life was more comfortable without my indifferent father and my reckless stepmother. Years later, I started dating a senior colleague at work, and we eventually got married. After discussing it, we decided not to have a wedding ceremony. If I had a wedding ceremony, I would have to face my father and stepmother. I just couldn't accept that. Instead, I wore a wedding dress and sent only my father a photo of it. After that, the life of just my husband and me began. We were happiest planning our future life together, like building a house once we saved a bit more money or thinking about having children soon. In the years since I started living alone, I rarely heard from my father, so it was a shock when his name appeared on my smartphone screen that day. "Hello, what do you want now?" The voice that came through the phone was of a man I didn't recognize. He introduced himself as one of my father's colleagues and said that my father had suddenly collapsed at work and was taken to the hospital. I was on a break at work, so I explained this situation to my boss and immediately took a taxi to the hospital where my father was taken. When I arrived at the hospital, there was a man in a suit standing at the entrance. It seemed he had come to meet me. He led me to a hospital room where my father lay in bed, looking pale, with various tubes connected to him and not moving at all. "Dad," I involuntarily sat down beside the bed, and my father's colleague offered me a chair and said, We can't reach his wife. It seemed he had tried to contact my stepmother at the same time as me but couldn't get through, no matter how many times he called. Such bad timing in an emergency. My father's colleague said he would try to contact her again, but I couldn't trouble him further. Reluctantly, I decided to call my stepmother from my smartphone. I tried calling, but she didn't answer. 10 minutes later, I called again with the same result. About 30 minutes later, my stepmother finally called back. "What do you want? It's troublesome to receive so many calls." "I have my own things to deal with," she grumbled. I finally got through. "Actually, Dad has collapsed and is now at the hospital. It's the big hospital in front of the station. When can you come?" As I relayed this with restrained irritation, my stepmother groaned. Then, in an unnaturally cheerful voice, she said, "Well, I can't make it. I'm really busy. So I'll leave everything about him to you, Kelly. Call me if something happens. Bye-bye." Before I could reply, my stepmother had already hung up unilaterally. I tried to call back immediately, but couldn't get through. She might have turned off her phone. I had thought that even a woman who cheated would come to the hospital if her husband collapsed, but I was too optimistic. "Leave everything to you," as she said. My stepmother did not come to visit, let alone care for him during that time. I took care of hospital admissions, daily care, and paperwork using up my paid leave. Although my father and I had been estranged for years, I was still worried about him in this situation. I did everything I could, hoping he would wake up soon. As I visited the hospital daily, but that wish was not fulfilled. Eventually, my father never woke up and passed away. Then things were so hectic, I barely remember them, and I had no time to mourn. I had to contact lawyers and acquaintances from the law firm my father had started, arrange for the funeral, and there was a lot to do. The people from my father's office helped with contacting relevant parties, which was a relief. But my stepmother did nothing as she had said, and only showed up on the day of the funeral. There, in front of everyone, she cried at my father's coffin. She hadn't helped when my father or I was in trouble, but she acted like a tragic heroine when others were watching. Watching how far would she go in mocking people? At that moment, I found myself moving. I forcefully grabbed my stepmother's arm and took her outside the venue. "Enough, you are so insincere. Never show your face to me again." I said this in anger. My stepmother immediately stopped crying. "Huh, what?" Acting all high and mighty, huh? "Fine, I'll leave for today. Just wait and see who will have the last laugh later." With those ominous words, she left with loud footsteps. 2 weeks later, after the funeral, and once everything settled down, I visited my childhood home for the first time in years. I was there to start organizing my father's belongings in earnest. While I had previously moved documents related to his work to his law firm, personal items like his clothes and books had remained untouched. I didn't think my stepmother would bother to sort through them, so it was up to me. About an hour into sorting and cleaning, my stepmother, who seemed to have been out, came home. She burst into the living room with vigor. "Oh my, Kelly, what are you doing here? This house is mine now. You shouldn't just come in uninvited." She said this in a tone one might use to scold a small child. I countered while I continued to organize my father's effects. "Yours? This is my childhood home. The one intruding is you." At that, my stepmother placed her hands on her hips and puffed out her chest dramatically. "This house and $1 million inheritance are mine to inherit, but because I'm generous, I might share a little with you. How about, say, $50? I couldn't help but laugh at her high-pitched laughter. This seemed to annoy her, and she frowned deeply, her face clearly showing displeasure. "What's so funny? What are you even talking about? You have no right to the inheritance. As I said this, my stepmother froze as if time had stopped. And when she finally understood, her face turned red with anger. I am his wife. It's only natural that I inherit the house and the money, she insisted. Yes, his common-law wife, right? Common-law spouses aren't legal heirs. Didn't you know that? I widened my eyes in feigned surprise. You probably avoided submitting a marriage certificate to have an easy out when your affairs were discovered. But it backfired, didn't it? You're always sloppy when it matters most. Sorry, but you can't kick me out. It's you who should be leaving. Oh, and if you need money, shall I give you some? How about, let's see, $50? I said this as if releasing years of pent-up frustration. My stepmother's face turned even redder, probably from embarrassment. But a common-law wife can inherit if there's a will, right? And what about being the beneficiary of a life insurance policy? My stepmother was desperately trying to find a way to get her hands on the inheritance, but it was futile. I am the beneficiary of the life insurance, and there was no will. He passed away suddenly, and I think survivor's pension might be difficult too. You would need to prove your status as a common-law wife, but with evidence of your affairs, it's probably not going to be recognized. Though I wasn't very familiar with the details of survivor pensions, it seemed effective in intimidating my stepmother as her hopes were dashed one by one. Her face grew more stern, and I delivered the final blow. You're a complete stranger here. Pack your things and leave, or I'll call the police, I stated firmly. My stepmother bit her lower lip in frustration, hurriedly packed her clothes into a suitcase, and stormed out of the house. Rumors of what happened to her reached me later. Having relied on my father's income, she hadn't worked for years. Therefore, she couldn't find a full-time job now and was living a day-to-day life doing odd jobs. However, her selfish nature didn't change, and she soon tried to approach old acquaintances for support. But none of them were willing to take her in. Who was lacking money and no longer possessing the beauty of her youth? Then my stepmother took an outrageous step. She appeared before my husband claiming, I am more beautiful and appealing as a woman than Kelly. It seemed she wanted to orchestrate a scenario where I would witness this and think it was an affair. But naturally, my husband refused her advances. Frustrated at not getting money, my stepmother tried to wreck my family, which only made her seem pitiful. Later, I swiftly called the police, and my stepmother received a stern warning. Hopefully, she learned her lesson from this incident. Incidentally, when I was sorting through my father's belongings, I found something curious. It was his diary. Though it might be wrong to read someone's diary, even if they have passed away, I was too curious about his thoughts and read a little. The entries were full of words of concern for my health and future prospects. Is Kelly eating properly? Is she not suffering too much at her job? Were some of the lines written? It appeared that my father had worked so hard because he wanted to ensure I wouldn't struggle financially in the future. Tucked in the diary was a photo. It showed my young father, my biological mother, and me, all smiling. I was in my mother's arms, and my father was hugging her shoulder. Seeing that photo, I finally felt it. I was loved by my parents. There was another photo in the diary, a recent one of my father and my stepmother. While I didn't understand why my father maintained a common-law relationship with my stepmother, it seemed he cared about her in his way. Unfortunately, that feeling was not reciprocated by her. I resolved to become someone who could not only receive love, but also understand it. Then, to my joy, I found out I was pregnant. We recently visited the hospital, and it seems the baby is developing well. Looking ahead to when our child grows up, my husband and I decided to live in the house my father left us. Our current rented apartment doesn't have enough space for a child's room. We've decided to spend money for our child's sake. Everything is for the sake of our forthcoming child. Just as my parents loved me, I will love this child. I made that promise to myself.